They called her a desk warrior the moment she stepped through the door, snickering that she'd probably wrestled more spreadsheets than enemies. But when her sleeve caught on the edge of her wrist wrap, revealing 7 jagged scars etched into her skin, the room froze. Those weren't tattoos. They weren't for show. They were proof of a truth that hit harder than any punch. She wasn't just another face in the morning PT lineup. She was the reason their unit had a mission to begin with. Want to know what those scars meant? And why 3 brash recruits learned a lesson they'd never forget? Hit subscribe, drop your location in the comments, and let's dive in. The dawn barely broke over the chain-link fence of Fort Halstead, a sprawling joint base where the air carried the sharp tang of diesel and damp concrete. Sergeant Mara Cade, 44, pushed through the heavy glass doors of Hangar 12's gym, the faint squeak of hinges cutting through the quiet. The place smelled of rubber mats and stale ambition, a universal scent that clung to every military fitness center from Pendleton to Lejeune. Overhead, LED lights hummed, bathing the room in a sterile glow that sharpened every edge and shadow, making the world feel both too real and slightly off. Mara moved with a precision that spoke of years spent counting every motion. Her dark hair was knotted tightly under a weathered cap, the kind faded from too many washes and too much sun. Her PT shirt, a threadbare gray, clung to her frame, the unit patch on the shoulder reduced to a ghost of its former self. Her boots, scuffed but sturdy, bore the marks of terrain that no training course could replicate. There was no flash to her, no need to broadcast her presence, just a quiet purpose that set her apart from the reservists who shuffled in for their weekend drills. At the check-in desk, Private Ellis barely looked up from his phone, swiping through a roster with the sluggish indifference of someone stuck on early duty. Sunlight spilled through smudged windows, catching flecks of dust in the air. "Scan your finger," he muttered, nodding toward a biometric pad that looked like it had been through a war of its own. "Green means you're good." Mara pressed her thumb to the scanner. It flickered, then glowed steady green. Ellis squinted at the screen, his brow furrowing as her name popped up. Mara Cade. Something about it tugged at his memory, but he couldn't place it. "You here for the sparring session?" he asked, his tone half curious, half doubting. "Cleared for it," she replied, her voice flat but firm, like she was stating the weather. "No need to argue, no need to explain." Ellis scrolled through his tablet, found no red flags, and shrugged. "Main floor's that way. Gear's on the right if you need it." She nodded, her duffel swaying lightly as she moved through the gate. Her boots tapped softly on the polished floor, the sound swallowed by the growing hum of the gym waking up. Inside, the air was cooler, stirred by massive ceiling fans that droned like distant helicopters. Morning light sliced through high windows, painting golden streaks across the sparring mats. The faint scent of bleach lingered, battling the musk of worn equipment. Near the weight racks, 3 reservists lounged in a loose huddle: Carter, Reese, and Vaughn. All in their mid-20s, they carried the cocky ease of men who'd mastered the art of looking tough without ever being tested. Lean, gym-sculpted, they moved with the confidence of guys who'd never had to drag a buddy through a firefight. Carter spotted Mara first, his eyes tracking her with the lazy amusement of someone bored and looking for a target. "Well, look at this," he said, smirking. "Lost another clerk on her way to the admin office?" Reese chuckled, his grin sharp. "Bet she's got a black belt in filing. Look at that shirt. Probably issued when Eisenhower was in charge." Vaughn, hefting a dumbbell with more flair than effort, snorted. "Desk warrior guaranteed. Probably got a medal for stapling forms in record time." Their laughter rolled across the gym, blending with the clank of weights and the low hum of the fans. It was the kind of laugh that felt clever when no one important was listening. Mara ignored them, setting her duffel against the wall with a soft thud. She unzipped it with deliberate care, pulling out a pair of worn hand wraps. Simple, black, no logos or frills. Just tools that had seen enough use to mold perfectly to her hands. She began wrapping her wrists, each loop precise, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of someone who could do this blindfolded. As she worked, her compression sleeves shifted slightly, revealing flashes of scarred skin beneath. Not ink, but marks, jagged, deliberate lines carved into her forearms with a permanence that spoke of something deeper than decoration. Carter noticed, his smirk faltering as he tried to make sense of what he saw. "Hey, Sarge," he called, his tone dripping with mock friendliness. "What's with the arm art? Going for a post-apocalyptic vibe?" Mara didn't look up, her focus on the wraps unbroken. "Not quite," she said, her voice slicing through the gym's noise with quiet clarity. "But I'm happy to show you what it's for." Reese laughed, though it sounded less certain now. "Okay, tough lady, this is combatives, not a knitting circle. You sure you're in the right place?" She finished her left wrist and started on the right, her movements as steady as a metronome. "I'm where I need to be," she said, the words landing with a weight that made the air feel heavier. The three men exchanged glances, their bravado wavering as they sensed they'd stepped into something they didn't fully grasp. Vaughn, trying to keep the mood light, leaned forward, squinting at her arm. "What? You burn those in for fun? Some kind of edgy LARP thing?" Mara stood, rolling her shoulders slightly, her gaze meeting his. It wasn't angry or defensive, just steady, like she was measuring him and finding him wanting. "Let's spar," she said simply. "You'll figure it out." The gym's energy shifted, the casual chatter fading as heads turned toward the sparring mats. The mats themselves were regulation perfect, taped down with military precision, surrounded by enough space for a crowd to gather. Mara stepped onto the center, her boots leaving faint imprints on the surface. She began her warm-up, nothing flashy, just a series of movements that spoke of years of discipline. A steady jog in place, arms loose, then deep lunges that showed a flexibility most of the younger soldiers couldn't match. Every motion was controlled, purposeful, like a blade being honed. Carter nudged Reese, his voice low, but not low enough. "She's doing warm-ups like it's a middle school gym class. This is going to be a massacre." Staff Sergeant Nolan appeared from the equipment room, clutching a battered clipboard like it was an extension of his arm. Short, stocky, with a face that didn't bother with unnecessary smiles. He'd been running this gym for years and could spot trouble from across the room. "Sparring rotations open," he called, his voice cutting through the gym's hum. "Sign up on the board, light contact, follow the rules, or you're out." Mara walked to the board, her movements unhurried. She took the pen, its chain rattling softly, and wrote her name in sharp, precise letters. M. Cade. Nolan glanced at it, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You good for this, Sergeant?" he asked, his tone professional but probing. She met his gaze, unflinching. "Yes, Sergeant." Carter, hovering nearby, read her name over Nolan's shoulder and snorted. She actually signed up. "This I gotta see." Mara turned to him, her expression calm but with a flicker of something that made his grin falter. "Step up then," she said. "Let's test your theories." Nolan's eyes flicked between them, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, as if he already knew how this would play out. "Keep it clean," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "No embarrassing the uniform!" They stepped onto the mat, the gym's noise fading into a tense hum. Carter bounced on his toes, rolling his shoulders with exaggerated flair, his movements all show, and no substance. He looked like he'd learned to fight from YouTube tutorials. Fast, flashy, but untested. Mara, by contrast, stood still, her weight balanced, hands relaxed at her sides. She wasn't coiled or tense, just ready, her presence filling the space like a storm about to break. "Go easy on me, Sarge," Carter said, his grin wide but brittle, playing to his audience of Reese and Vaughn. The timer buzzed. Carter moved first, circling her with quick, light steps, throwing soft jabs to test her range. Mara didn't react, just tracked him with her eyes, shifting her stance slightly to stay centered. He was looking for a tell, a weakness, but she gave him nothing. When he finally lunged with a sharp right hook, confident in his speed, she moved. It was over in a blink. One moment, Carter's fist was slicing through the air. The next, he was flipping over her hip, his own momentum betraying him. He hit the mat with a thud that echoed, the air rushing out of him in a sharp grunt. The gym went silent, weights pausing mid-lift, conversations cutting off mid-sentence. Carter lay there, blinking up at the ceiling, trying to piece together what had just happened. "Lucky shot," he muttered, scrambling to his feet, his voice tight with embarrassment. Mara didn't respond, just reset her stance, her breathing even, her face unreadable. Carter squared up again, more cautious now, his earlier swagger replaced by something closer to respect, or at least caution. He tried a new tactic, a low charge meant to overpower her with his size. Mara sidestepped, her movement fluid, almost lazy, and hooked his leg as he passed. He went down again, sprawling across the mat, her knee pressing lightly against his chest, his wrist twisted just enough to make him wince. "Tap," she said, her voice calm, like she was asking for the time. Carter slapped the mat twice, and she released him instantly, stepping back. He sat up, rubbing his wrist, his face a mix of confusion and grudging admiration. "What was that?" he muttered. Nolan, watching from the sidelines, didn't bother hiding his smirk. "That," he said, "was experience." The gym's air seemed to thicken, the hum of the fans and the clank of weights fading into a tense hush. Carter climbed to his feet, his bravado dented but not gone, his shoulder still smarting from Mara Cade's effortless takedown. Reese and Vaughn stood by the weight racks, their earlier smirks replaced by a wary silence, their eyes flicking between their friend and the woman who'd just flipped him like he weighed nothing. Mara, unfazed, adjusted her wrist wraps with the same deliberate care she'd shown all morning, her movements precise, almost meditative. The scars on her forearms, 7 jagged lines etched deep and deliberate, peeked out from under her sleeves, catching the light like a warning no one had heeded. Reese tried to break the tension with a forced chuckle. "Okay, Sarge, you got some moves, but let's not get carried away. Carter's just warming up." His voice carried a hint of bravado, but it cracked at the edges, betraying his unease. Vaughn stayed quiet, his gaze fixed on Mara's scars, his mind clearly wrestling with what they might mean. Mara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her presence on the mat was answer enough, a quiet challenge that hung in the air like the faint buzz of the overhead lights. She stepped back to the center, her boots leaving soft imprints on the mat, her posture relaxed but ready. Carter, still rubbing his wrist, squared up again, his jaw tight. This time he wasn't playing for laughs. His movements were tighter, more controlled, as if he'd finally realized he wasn't sparring with an amateur. The timer buzzed again. Carter moved cautiously, his earlier flashiness replaced by a more calculated approach. He feinted left, then threw a quick jab, aiming to catch her off guard. Mara didn't flinch. Her eyes tracked his every move, her body shifting just enough to keep him in her line of sight. When he lunged with a combination, a jab followed by a low kick, she flowed around it like water, redirecting his momentum with a subtle twist of her wrist. Before he could recover, she swept his legs, sending him crashing to the mat again. This time, she didn't pin him. She just stepped back, letting him feel the weight of his own failure. Carter rolled to his knees, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "Okay," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're good. I get it." But his eyes said he didn't. Not fully. Not yet. Staff Sergeant Nolan, still clutching his clipboard, watched the exchange with a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Told you to keep it clean," he said, his tone dry. "You're lucky she's going easy." The gym's main door swung open with a low groan, and Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Drayton stepped inside. At 52, he carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need a raised voice to command attention. His uniform was crisp but practical, the creases sharp but not parade ground perfect, the mark of a man who'd spent more time in the field than behind a desk. His dark eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen every kind of soldier pass through these walls. Green recruits, seasoned operators, and everything in between. Drayton paused just inside the threshold, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. The usual morning chatter was gone, replaced by a tension that crackled like static. Carter sat on the edge of the mat, a towel draped over his shoulders, his face a mix of frustration and grudging respect. Reese and Vaughn leaned against the wall, their earlier cockiness replaced by something closer to caution. And in the center of the mat, Mara Cade adjusted her wraps, her focus absolute, her presence a quiet storm that seemed to pull the room's gravity toward her. Drayton approached Nolan, his boots clicking softly on the polished floor. "What's going on here, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice low but carrying the weight of command. Nolan handed over the clipboard, his expression neutral, but with a flicker of something that might have been respect. "New addition to the sparring roster. Signed herself in, says she's cleared." Drayton scanned the list, his pen pausing when he reached her name. M. Cade. His expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened slightly, a subtle shift that only someone who knew him well would notice. "Cade," he said, almost to himself, his voice careful, like he was testing the weight of the name. "You know her?" Nolan asked, his curiosity piqued. Drayton didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Mara, studying her with the intensity of a man piecing together a puzzle. She was tightening her wrist wraps, her movements methodical, and as she did, her compression sleeve slipped just enough to reveal the scars beneath. 7 lines, burned into her skin with a precision that spoke of ritual, not accident. Drayton's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering in his cheek as recognition settled in. He'd seen marks like those before, in reports that were never meant to see daylight, in briefings that came with a warning to forget what you'd heard. They weren't just scars. They were a ledger, written in fire. Reese, still trying to salvage some sense of control, called out from the sidelines. "What's with the war paint, Sarge? You into some kind of hardcore cosplay?" His tone was light, but it fell flat, the words sounding hollow in the heavy air. Drayton's head snapped toward him, his gaze sharp enough to cut through steel. "You have any idea what you're looking at, soldier?" The question wasn't just a challenge, it was a warning. The kind that made you realize you'd wandered into dangerous territory without a map. Reese blinked, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Drayton's stare. "Just, the scars. Looks intense." Drayton stepped closer to Mara, his movements deliberate, respectful. "Mind if I ask where you're stationed now, Sergeant?" His tone was professional, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity, maybe even admiration. Mara looked up, meeting his eyes without hesitation. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a strength in it, like a blade sheathed but ready. "Off the books," she said. "Contractor status, cleared about 6 months ago." Drayton nodded, the pieces falling into place. "They finally sorted your paperwork?" "Enough to walk through doors like this," she said, her lips twitching in what might have been a smile. She gestured faintly at the gym, the mats, the weights, the world she'd stepped back into. Drayton turned to the 3 reservists, who were watching the exchange with growing unease. The gym's casual morning vibe was gone, replaced by a weight that pressed against their chests. "Those scars you're mocking," he said, his voice steady but laced with an edge that demanded attention. "They're not for show. They're not tattoos you pick up on a whim. They're a record, burned into the skin because ink wouldn't survive the places she's been." The room went still, the hum of the fan sounding louder in the silence. Even the soldiers at the far end of the gym paused, sensing something bigger unfolding. Drayton gestured toward Mara's forearms, where the scars were still partially visible. "Each one marks a confirmed kill from missions that don't exist on paper. Operations so deep you won't find them in any training manual. That's not decoration. That's history, carved by fire because it had to last." Carter's face paled, his hands clenching the towel around his neck. Vaughn stared at the floor, his earlier quips forgotten. Reese swallowed hard, his attempt at a joke now feeling like a misstep in a minefield. "Sergeant Cade ran point for Recon Group 5, Drayton continued, his voice carrying the weight of truth. "Deep insertion, black budget ops in places you've never heard of, places where a single mistake means you don't come back. Those 7 scars, That's 7 lives ended to keep others alive, and that's just the ones they let her mark. Mara didn't react, didn't bask in the revelation, or shy away from it. She just finished adjusting her wraps and began packing her duffel, her movements as calm and precise as ever. Her silence spoke louder than any explanation could, a testament to a life lived on terms the reservists couldn't yet comprehend. Reese found his voice, though it came out small. "We didn't know." "No," Drayton said, his tone softening but still firm. "You didn't. And that's the first lesson you're learning today." The gym at Fort Halstead stood frozen, the air heavy with the weight of Lieutenant Colonel Drayton's words. The hum of the ceiling fan seemed louder now, filling the silence left by the absence of clanking weights or casual chatter. Mara Cade shouldered her duffel, her movements as steady and deliberate as they'd been all morning, the 7 scars on her forearms now hidden beneath her compression sleeves. She didn't linger, didn't bask in the stunned gazes of the reservists, Carter, Reese, and Vaughn, who stood by the weight racks, their earlier bravado reduced to a quiet unease. The lesson had landed, but its full impact was still sinking in, like a stone dropped into deep water. Drayton's dark eyes swept over the 3 younger men, his expression a mix of sternness and something almost paternal. He tucked his clipboard under his arm, his voice cutting through the stillness with the precision of a well-aimed shot. "You 3 thought you had her pegged, didn't you? Desk warrior, paper pusher, someone who'd crumble under a real challenge." He paused, letting the words settle. "But the truth is, Sergeant Cade's been through more in one mission than you'll see in a lifetime of weekend drills." Carter, still sitting on the edge of the mat, looked up, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and something that might have been respect. His shoulder ached where Mara's throw had landed, a dull reminder of how effortlessly she'd dismantled him. "We didn't mean anything by it," he said, his voice quieter than before, lacking its earlier edge. "Just thought she was, regular." Drayton's gaze didn't soften, but it wasn't cruel either. "That's the thing about this life," he said. "You never know who's standing in front of you. That supply clerk pushing your forms might have humped a ruck through Fallujah. That quiet mechanic fixing your Humvee might have pulled a squad out of an ambush. And that woman you called a desk warrior?" He nodded toward Mara, who was now at the gym's threshold, her silhouette framed against the morning light spilling through the glass doors. "She's the reason some of you are standing here at all." Mara paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle. She didn't turn, but her posture shifted slightly, as if acknowledging the room one last time. "Rust was never my problem," she said, her voice low but clear, carrying a trace of dry humor that cut through the tension like a knife. Then she pushed through the door, the soft hiss of the hinges marking her exit. The silence that followed was thick, unbroken by the usual gym noise. No one moved to lift a weight or crack a joke. Carter stared at the mat where he'd been thrown, replaying the moment in his mind, trying to understand how someone who looked so unassuming could move with such lethal precision. Reese leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his earlier quips now a faint memory. Vaughn, still silent, traced the outline of his own wrist, as if imagining the scars he'd mocked. Drayton let the moment linger, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in not just the 3 reservists, but the handful of other soldiers who'd stopped to watch. "You're going to carry this morning with you," he said finally, his voice measured but firm. "The question is what you do with it. File it away as a story to laugh about later, or let it change how you see the world." He stepped toward the door, his boots clicking softly on the polished floor. "Next time you think you've got someone figured out, because of their age, their job, their clothes, remember Sergeant Cade. Remember those scars. And remember that the most dangerous people you'll ever meet don't need to tell you how dangerous they are." The door closed behind him with a quiet thud, leaving the gym in a stillness that felt almost sacred. Carter, Reese, and Vaughn stood in the wake of the lesson, each grappling with the weight of their own assumptions. They'd come to the gym expecting a routine morning, a chance to flex their egos and trade barbs. Instead, they'd been handed a truth they couldn't unlearn. Respect wasn't owed. It was earned. And sometimes it came in the form of a quiet woman with scars that told a story they'd never fully understand. Outside, Mara crossed the parking lot, the morning sun warm on her back, casting a long shadow across the cracked asphalt. Fort Halstead stretched out around her, its fences and buildings unchanged from an hour ago, but inside Hangar 12, something had shifted. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered, not with words or boasts, but with the quiet certainty of someone who'd walked through fire and come out the other side. As she reached her truck, a battered pickup with dust still clinging to its tires from some distant road, she slung her duffel into the passenger seat. The scars on her forearms caught the light one last time before she pulled her sleeves down, hiding them from view. They weren't for show, never had been. They were a reminder, not for her, but for anyone who dared to look closely enough to understand. Inside the gym, the three reservists began to move again, their motions slow, almost tentative. Carter picked up his towel, his fingers lingering on the fabric as he replayed Mara's throw in his mind. Reese pushed off the wall, his usual swagger muted, his eyes distant. Vaughn grabbed a water bottle, but his hands were unsteady, as if the weight of what he'd seen was still settling in. The other soldiers in the gym resumed their routines, but the air was different now, charged with a new awareness. They'd all witnessed something that morning, not just a sparring match, but a glimpse into a world beyond their own. A world where scars told stories, where quiet strength spoke louder than bravado, and where respect was a currency earned through actions, not words. What would you have done if you'd seen those scars? Would you have recognized them for what they were? A record of battles fought in shadows? Of lives taken to protect others? Or would you have laughed, like Carter, Reese, and Vaughn, only to learn the hard way that appearances lie? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if this story reminded you that strength often hides in plain sight,